December 18th, 1944, near Bastogne, Belgium. The cold was a physical presence, a weight so deep it felt like it was in your bones. In the suffocating silence of the Ardennes forest, where the snow smothered every sound, Corporal Eddie Voss sat in a frozen foxhole, a world away from his home in Milwaukee. He wasn't a frontline rifleman, he was a radio operator. And in a war where communication was life, his ears were the loneliest outpost on the entire Western Front. He pressed the headset tighter against his ears, trying to block out the biting wind. Through the crackling static, he heard it. A German voice, calm and professional. A Panzer commander reading out a string of coordinates. It was routine chatter, the kind of thing he'd been hearing for days. But then, something made his blood not just run cold, but freeze solid. The coordinates, they weren't for a German attack on another German unit. They were for American positions. 300 American GIs, fast asleep in a makeshift camp just 2 miles west of him. Right now, you're about to hear the incredible true story of a forbidden radio transmission, an act so contrary to military law that it was almost erased from history. This is the story of how one man broke every rule in the book to save his brothers, and why the army tried to bury what happened next. Stick with me, because what you are about to discover is a side of wartime heroism you've never been told. See, Eddie Voss wasn't supposed to be listening to the enemy. The US Army Signal Corps had rules, and those rules were written in steel. Operators were assigned Allied frequencies, and that was it. You relay messages, you maintain your gear, you stay in your lane. You absolutely do not tune into enemy broadcasts without direct authorization from G2 intelligence. The reasons made perfect sense on paper. It prevented operators from being tricked by German disinformation. It stopped a lone wolf from accidentally giving away his position. And most of all, it kept the complex web of Allied communications secure. But Eddie had never been much good at following rules he didn't believe in. He was the son of German immigrants who had fled the turmoil of the Weimar Republic in 1923. They spoke German in their Milwaukee home, a comforting echo of the old world. Right up until the day Pearl Harbor was attacked. Suddenly, that language became a liability, a whisper to be kept behind closed doors. But Eddie had already absorbed it. He didn't just learn the words, he learned the music behind them from his grandmother, the subtle differences between a Prussian and a Bavarian accent, the slang a soldier from Hamburg might use versus one from Munich. When he enlisted, the army tested his German, marked him as fluent, and should have sent him to a comfortable desk job in London translating captured documents. But in the grand, chaotic lottery of military bureaucracy, his papers got shuffled. He was assigned to the 101st Airborne, not as a translator, but as a field radio operator. His job was to fix busted equipment and relay Allied coordinates, spending most of his time cold, bored, and dreaming of a warm meal. Then came the Bulge. When Hitler threw his last desperate gamble into the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes on December 16th, the American lines didn't just bend. They ceased to exist. Entire divisions were cut off, surrounded. Communication networks collapsed into a mess of static and panicked voices. In that chaos, Eddie found himself in a foxhole with two things: a fully functional SCR-300 radio and a pair of high-quality German headphones he'd scavenged from a wrecked half-track. With nothing but time and the endless cold, he started to do the one thing he was explicitly forbidden to do. He started to listen. At first, it was just a way to fight the crushing boredom. He'd slowly turn the dial, picking up ghosts in the static. German tank crews complaining about the cold, infantry squads calling for more ammunition, artillery spotters adjusting their fire. They were just voices in the dark, men speaking his grandmother's language, all of them trying to kill him and his friends. But Eddie had a gift, and it wasn't just for languages. Before the war, he'd worked as a troubleshooter for the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company. When a power grid went down, he didn't just listen to the engineers. He listened to the machines themselves. He knew the unique hum of a transformer under strain, the rhythmic click of a healthy circuit breaker. He could hear the pattern in the chaos, diagnosing a problem before it turned catastrophic. Now, sitting in the frozen mud of Belgium, he started to hear that same kind of music again. He heard a Panzer commander who always cleared his throat with a gruff moment mal before giving an order, an artillery spotter who spoke with a faint lisp, a supply officer whose every transmission ended with a bored, monotone ende. He started taking notes. He wasn't trained in intelligence, but he had something better: intuition. He sketched maps, logged call signs, noted frequencies and transmission times. Within 3 days, he could recognize individual German operators by their voice alone. He knew which panzer unit was northeast of Bastogne. He knew they were dangerously low on fuel, and he knew their commander was a cautious, methodical man who was absolutely terrified of American mines. On the fourth night, December 18th, as the snow fell thicker, Eddie heard the voice of that cautious commander again, the one with the smoker's rasp. A new set of orders was coming through. Eddie's pencil flew across his notepad, his fingers numb from the cold. The words were tactical, professional, mundane, but their meaning was an apocalypse in the making. The German column was being redirected. Their new target, a fuel depot 2 miles west. Eddie stared at his notes, his own breath catching in his throat. He knew that depot. It was surrounded by 300 American GIs from a support company, men who thought they were miles from the front line, men who were right now sleeping, completely unaware that 40 German tanks were about to erase them from the map. His hand shot toward his own transmitter to call headquarters, but he stopped. The rules. Report through proper channels. Do not engage. Monitor Allied frequencies only. But proper channels meant time. Time for his report to be vetted, questioned, passed up the chain of command, and likely dismissed as the ravings of an over-eager corporal. By then, it would be too late. The only sound left would be the grinding of tank treads over frozen earth. In the corner of his foxhole sat the German radio he'd pulled from the half-track, a piece of forbidden equipment. His eyes darted between his American radio and the German one, between the rules and the reality, between protocol and the lives of 300 men. He made a decision that would change not only his life, but the course of this forgotten battle. He reached for the German radio. He was about to break every rule he'd ever been taught. Because in that frozen hole, Eddie Voss understood a terrible truth. Sometimes, to save your brothers, you have to become the monster they fear. For 72 hours, Eddie Voss had lived inside the head of the German Panzer commander. The man had become more real to him than some of the guys in his own platoon. He knew the commander's rhythms, the small tells that painted a picture of the man behind the microphone. The slight pause before announcing coordinates, as if he were double-checking a map one last time. The way he said, "Jawohl," with a downward, resigned inflection when acknowledging orders he clearly disagreed with. The almost silent sigh that followed demands for impossible timelines from his superiors. The commander's call sign was Eisenfaust via Iron Fist 4, but in the privacy of his own mind, Eddie had started calling him Klaus. There was no reason for it, no intelligence to suggest that was his name. It just felt right. Klaus sounded tired. Klaus sounded competent. Klaus sounded like a man who had been fighting for far too long and just wanted to go home, but would do his duty to the bitter end, because that's what men like Klaus did. Understanding Klaus wasn't just academic, it was the key. Eddie had stumbled upon a critical secret about German radio discipline, or more accurately, the sudden lack of it. On paper, the Wehrmacht's communication doctrine was a thing of terrifying efficiency, rigid, hierarchical, and layered with protocols. But that was under normal circumstances. The Battle of the Bulge was anything but normal. It had stretched German logistics and manpower to the breaking point. Radio operators were running on fumes, fighting exhaustion and frostbite. Equipment was failing in the brutal cold, and in their desperation to maintain coordination amidst the chaos, the Germans had started cutting corners, big ones. They had all but abandoned the complex code sequences used to authenticate transmissions. There just wasn't time. Instead, they'd reverted to something more primal, more human: recognition. They relied on knowing their officers' voices, the familiar cadence of an order delivered in the same format they'd heard 1,000 times before. It was faster, it was more practical in a pinch, and it was a catastrophic vulnerability if someone like Eddie Voss happened to be listening. Eddie had filled an entire notebook with his observations, a meticulous chronicle of this invisible battlefield. He'd mapped their transmission schedule. Klaus usually received his orders between 0200 and 0300 hours. The officer who gave Klaus his orders, a man with a clipped aristocratic accent, always began with the exact same phrase, Eisenfaust wir, hier Panzergruppe Kommando. But more importantly, Eddie had identified the emotional patterns. He learned that Klaus was absolutely, pathologically paranoid about mines. Every single time an order sent his column through unfamiliar territory, Klaus would request clarification, his voice tightening ever so slightly. Ist die Route verifiziert? Is the route verified? He'd ask it twice, sometimes 3 times. That fear wasn't irrational. From other bits of chatter, Eddie pieced together that Klaus had lost 2 panzers to American minefields in the past week. Good tanks and experienced crews, vaporized in an instant because some staff officer back at headquarters had misread a map. Klaus wasn't going to let that happen again. This should have made Eddie's developing plan impossible. How could you fool a man who was so cautious he questioned his own superiors? But Eddie understood something fundamental about human psychology. Suspicious people aren't suspicious of everything equally. They are suspicious of anomalies, of things that break the pattern. If you can match the pattern perfectly, if you sound exactly like what they expect to hear, the brain's suspicion trigger never fires. It simply accepts the familiar and moves on. The ethical weight of what he was considering was crushing. He wouldn't just be breaking a few army regulations. He would be committing an act of unauthorized psychological warfare, potentially derailing larger intelligence operations and risking instant death if he failed. If the Germans detected his deception and triangulated his position, they would turn his foxhole into a smoking crater. But it was more than that. He was planning to deceive a man he'd come to understand, maybe even, in a strange way, respect. Klaus was the enemy, yes. His tanks would kill Americans without hesitation, but Klaus was also just a man doing his job, a professional soldier trapped in the same frozen hell as he was. And Eddie was about to weaponize that man's deepest trauma to lead him and his crew to their graves. He stared at his notes as the snow began to fall again, a thick white curtain dropping over the world. The moral math was both simple and monstrous. Klaus and his 40 tanks versus 300 American infantrymen who had no idea they were about to be annihilated. There was no good choice here. There was only the choice that saved the most lives on his side of the line. But on the evening of December 18th, Eddie's ethical debate was rendered moot. The system made the decision for him. Captain Morrison appeared at the edge of his foxhole, a silhouette against the grey twilight, with 2 stone-faced MPs behind him. Someone had noticed Eddie's unauthorized listening. Someone had reported it, and now his entire world was about to come apart. Morrison didn't waste time. He stood there, snowflakes melting on his shoulders, and held out a gloved hand. "Give me the headset, Corporal." Eddie's stomach plunged. He slowly pulled the headphones off, the faint crackle of German voices dying as they left his ears. "Sir, I can explain. You've been monitoring enemy frequencies, without authorization, for 4 days." Morrison's voice was flat, controlled, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. "You've filled notebooks with intelligence you have no clearance to collect, and you've been using a captured enemy radio without reporting it." One of the MPs slid down into the foxhole and began, with cold efficiency, to dismantle Eddie's world. The SCR-300 was disconnected. Then the prized German headphones. Then the precious notebook, 4 days of work, disappeared into an equipment bag. "Sir, you don't understand," Eddie pleaded, his voice cracking. "There's a Panzer Column. I know where they're going." "I understand perfectly, Corporal." Morrison cut him off, his voice like chipping ice. "You are a radio operator, not an intelligence analyst. We have trained personnel for that. What you've been doing is reckless, unauthorized, and it compromises operational security for everyone. Eddie's mind was racing. He had to make him see. There's a German commander, call sign Eisenfaust Vier. He's moving on the fuel depot west of here. There are 300 men there, sir. They're asleep. Enough! Morrison's jaw tightened. Do you have any idea how many false reports G2 gets every day from well-meaning GIs who think they've cracked the Enigma code with a German dictionary? Every private who speaks a little hometown German thinks he's going to win the war by himself. This isn't false, sir. I've been tracking him for. You've been listening to chatter you are not trained to properly interpret, Morrison said, gesturing to the MP who was now hauling out the captured German radio. For all you know, you've been listening to a deliberate deception. The Germans know we listen. They feed us bad intel constantly to send us on wild goose chases. A cold despair began to settle in Eddie's gut. It wasn't anger. It was the chilling realization that Morrison wasn't going to listen. He wasn't going to check. He was just going to follow the book. Sir, please, Eddie said, his voice now quiet. Just verify it. Send a runner to the depot. Tell them to be on alert. That's all I'm asking. Captain Morrison looked at Eddie for a long, hard moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost gentle, which was somehow worse. Voss, you're a good operator. You've kept our comms up under impossible conditions. But you crossed a line. You will cease all monitoring of enemy frequencies, effective immediately. Hobby. With anyone. And if I find out you've so much as looked at enemy equipment again, I will have you court-martialed. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. The words tasted like ash. Good. Get some sleep. You look like hell. Morrison turned and climbed out of the foxhole, the MPs following him like shadows, carrying away all of Eddie's hopes. Eddie sat alone in the sudden, crushing silence. The German radio was gone. His notes were gone. His ears on the enemy were gone. And somewhere out there in the suffocating darkness, 40 German tanks were getting ready to roll over 300 sleeping Americans, and the one man who could have stopped it had just been told to stand down. Eddie sat in the suffocating silence, the weight of his helplessness, a physical pressure on his chest. He tried to tell himself that Morrison would follow up, that a captain wouldn't just ignore a potential threat, no matter how unorthodox the source. He tried to believe that the system, the great, lumbering machine of the U.S. Army, would eventually work the way it was supposed to. But he'd been in that machine long enough to know better. Morrison would file a report. The report would land on a pile of other reports, and by the time intelligence got around to it, they'd be analyzing the smoking ruins of a fuel depot and writing condolence letters. The snow fell harder, a soft, relentless hiss that muffled the world, turning the landscape into a ghostly white canvas. Eddie pulled his wool coat tighter, trying to think, trying to find a way out of this dead end. There had to be another channel, another officer who might listen. Then, through the curtain of falling snow, he heard it. Voices. American voices, drifting from a supply trench about 30 yards away. He couldn't see them, but in the frigid night air, sound travelled with crystalline clarity. Pulled every available man for the defense perimeter, one voice said. Fuel depots practically empty of personnel now. Smart move, the other replied. If the Krauts break through, better to have the men than the diesel, assuming they even know where the hell it is. That sector's been dead quiet for 2 days. The voices faded as the officers moved on. Eddie sat perfectly still, the words echoing in his mind, each one a hammer blow. It wasn't just that the depot was undefended, it had been deliberately stripped of its defenders. Command had made a calculated gamble. They had bet the lives of 300 men on the enemy's ignorance. But Klaus wasn't ignorant. Eddie had heard the coordinates with his own ears, and in just under 4 hours, Klaus would get his final go order, and 40 Panzer tanks would descend on men who had been intentionally left exposed. The system hadn't just failed to protect them. The system had actively placed them in the crosshairs. He looked at the empty corner of his foxhole, where the captured German radio had been. It was gone, confiscated, probably locked away in a crate somewhere. But it wouldn't have been destroyed. Not yet. Equipment like that was valuable intelligence. It would be sent back for analysis, which meant It was still on the base. Somewhere. Eddie Voss had never stolen anything in his life. He had never directly disobeyed an order from a superior officer. He was the son of immigrants who had taught him 3 core tenets: work hard, follow the rules, and keep your head down. But sitting there in that frozen foxhole, listening to the silent fall of snow that would soon be shattered by explosions, Eddie realized that his entire life had been a preparation for this single moment. The moment when following the rules meant letting men die. He waited until 0130 hours. The witching hour. Guard rotations were changing. Exhaustion and the bone-deep cold had dulled the senses of men who had been on high alert for weeks. The camp was as asleep as it would ever be. With a quiet prayer his grandmother had taught him, Eddie Voss climbed out of his foxhole and melted into the snow-swept darkness. The supply depot was a chaotic maze of canvas tents and stacks of wooden crates. To a new arrival, it was indecipherable. But Eddie had been on this base for months. He knew the sentries' patrol routes by heart. He knew which tents held ammunition, which held rations, and which one was designated for counterintelligence. The CI tent was little more than a glorified storage shed where confiscated enemy gear sat, waiting for some officer with the right clearance to tag it for transport to London. It was guarded, of course, but not heavily. In the middle of the biggest land battle in American history, who in their right mind would try to steal a broken enemy radio? He crouched behind a stack of jerry cans, his breath pluming in the air, and watched the guard. A young kid, 19 at most, stamping his feet to fight off the creeping numbness. Every 2 minutes, like clockwork, he'd turn and walk 10 paces down the line of tents, just to keep his blood moving. 10 paces away. 10 seconds of opportunity. Eddie waited for the turn. The moment the sentry's back was to him, he moved, low and fast, a ghost in the swirling snow. He slipped under the tent flap and was plunged into a world of organized chaos. German Lugers, binoculars, helmets, and blood-stained maps, all neatly tagged. And there, in the corner, sitting in a wooden crate stenciled with the words, "For Analysis, London," was his radio. He grabbed it, his frozen fingers fumbling with the cold metal, and was back out of the tent in less than 15 seconds. Back in the relative safety of his foxhole, his hands were shaking uncontrollably, not from cold, but from adrenaline. He checked the radio. It was a robust piece of German engineering, built to last. The antenna was intact. The battery was low, dangerously low, but the needle was still in the green. He figured he had maybe 2 hours of broadcast power before it died for good. He couldn't just write a script. If he sounded like he was reading, a veteran commander like Klaus would know instantly. So instead, he tore a scrap of paper from his notebook and began writing phonetic cues, reminders. The specific rhythm of a Panzergruppe command officer. The formal, clipped military phrasing. The precise terminology. Eisenfaust wir, hier Panzergruppe Kommando, neue Befehle. Iron Fist 4. This is Tank Group Command. New orders. He whispered the phrase over and over, refining his accent. Too sharp, and he'd sound Bavarian. Too soft, and it would be Austrian. The command structure Klaus answered to was Prussian, from northern Germany. The accent had to be crisp, from Berlin or Hamburg. Precise vowels, clipped consonants. He was mimicking a social class he had never known. He'd learned his German from working-class immigrants and shopkeepers in Milwaukee. He was trying to sound like a Prussian aristocrat, a career military man who spoke with the effortless authority of someone who had never been questioned in his life. But he had an advantage no actor could ever have. He had spent 4 days listening to the real thing. He could hear their voices in his memory the exact way they pronounced the word Koordinaten, the slight emphasis on the second syllable of Angriffsroute. He closed his eyes, shut out the world, and let those ghostly voices become his own. The technical part was easier. He knew the frequency. 43.4 megahertz. It was seared into his brain. The real challenge was timing. Transmit too early, and Klaus might receive contradictory orders from his actual command. Transmit too late, and the Panzers would already be on the move. He had to hit the narrow window when Klaus would be expecting orders, but before the real orders arrived. Based on 4 days of meticulous observation, that window opened at precisely 0217 hours. The real orders usually came between 0230 and 0245. That gave him a 15-minute window. 15 minutes to save 300 lives. Or to get court-martialed and possibly executed for treason. He checked his watch. 0203 hours. 14 minutes to go. The gravity of what he was about to do settled upon him. He was about to impersonate an enemy officer, broadcast on their frequencies, and conduct an unauthorized psychological operation of one. With numb fingers, he slowly turned the frequency dial. The radio crackled to life, a faint hiss of German voices bleeding through the static. Somewhere out in that frozen darkness, Klaus was listening, waiting. Eddie pulled his coat tight, the fear now gone, burned away and replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He picked up the microphone. His hand was perfectly steady. He was about to speak into the void, and with a few well-chosen words, he was going to change the world. At precisely 0216 hours, Eddie picked up the microphone. The plastic felt slick and alien in his hand. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, but his breathing was slow and even. He was no longer Corporal Eddie Voss from Milwaukee. He was a Prussian officer, tired, professional, and about to deliver an order that would not be questioned. He keyed the transmitter, watched the small red light glow like a baleful eye in the darkness, and spoke. Eisenfaust 4, hier Panzergruppe Kommando. His voice cut through the static with the clean precision of a surgeon's scalpel. He'd pitched it a fraction deeper than his natural register, adding a gravelly note of authority he'd heard so many times from Klaus's real commanders. The German words felt strange on his tongue, not because he didn't know them, but because for the first time in his life he was using them as a weapon. Silence. 5 agonizing seconds of nothing but atmospheric hiss. Eddie's mind screamed. Maybe Klaus isn't on frequency yet. Maybe the battery is too weak. Maybe they changed their call signs. Then a voice crackled back, so familiar it sent a jolt through him. Panzer Gruppe Kommando, hier Eisenfaust 4, bin bereit. Tank Group Command, this is Iron Fist 4, ready to receive. It was Klaus, the smoker's rasp, the weary professionalism. It was him. Eddie nearly let out a sob of relief. He forced himself to pause, counting to 3. A real commander would never rush. A real commander owned the silence. Eisenfaust 4, neue Befehle. Eddie transmitted, his voice a blade of ice. Ihre derzeitige Angriffsroute wird geändert. Iron Fist 4, new orders. Your current attack route is being changed. Another pause on the other end. This one was longer. Eddie could almost hear the gears turning in Klaus's head, miles away in his steel cocoon. He could feel the man's innate caution kicking in. Verstanden. Klaus's voice came back, tight with suspicion. Grund für die Änderung? Understood. Reason for the change? This was it, the critical moment, the inflection point where this entire insane gamble would either succeed or fail catastrophically. Eddie drew a slow breath and played the ace he'd been holding for 4 days. He delivered the line not as a warning, but as a cold, indisputable fact from a higher authority who had access to better intelligence. Luftaufklärung hat Minenfelder entlang ihrer ursprünglichen Route identifiziert. Amerikanische Pioniere haben in den letzten 12 Stunden die Verteidigungsstellungen verstärkt. Aerial reconnaissance has identified minefields along your original route. American engineers have reinforced defensive positions in the last 12 hours. He held his breath. He had spoken the forbidden word. Minenfelder. Minefields. The source of Klaus's trauma. The ghost that haunted his every decision. He was twisting a knife in a man's deepest fear, using it as a tool to steer him toward his death. The silence that followed stretched for 7 seconds. An eternity. Eddie could vividly picture Klaus in his command tank, the dim light glinting off his map case, his mind weighing this new, life-saving intelligence against the orders he already had. This wasn't an anomaly. It was a confirmation of his worst fears. It fit the pattern perfectly. Neue Route, bitte. Klaus finally said. New route, please. The suspicion in his voice was gone, replaced by a grim relief. Eddie's hand trembled as he reached for the crude map he had drawn. He had memorized the coordinates of the real American minefields northeast of their current position, killing grounds laid by US Army engineers. He was about to send 40 tanks and their crews into a place from which there was no return, and Klaus would thank him for it. Kursänderung auf 035, Referenzpunkt Hartmann 7. Eddie rattled off the new coordinates, each number a nail in a coffin. He wasn't sending Klaus toward the fuel depot anymore. He was sending him on a safer route, directly toward a sector of the forest that was uncontested for one simple reason. Both sides knew it was lethal. New target coordinates to follow. He had to give him a target. A simple change of course wasn't enough. It needed to be a believable objective. Not a major prize, but a small tactical win that would justify the last-minute change. Amerikanische Versorgungskolonne. Schwach verteidigt. American supply column, lightly defended. After taking the target, to hold position and await further orders, it was a brilliant lie in its simplicity. Plausible, unremarkable, nothing that would set off alarms. Verstanden, came the crisp reply. Eisenfaust 4 führt den Befehl aus. Voraussichtliche Ankunftszeit 0530. Understood. Iron Fist 4 will execute the order. Estimated time of arrival 0530. Bestätigt. Ende. Confirmed. Over. Eddie released the transmit button. He sat motionless in the darkness, his entire body now shaking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor as the adrenaline dump hit him. He had done it. Klaus had taken the bait. And in 3 hours, 40 German tanks would drive headlong into a death trap of their own making, guided by the voice of a ghost. But there was no triumph, only a hollow, aching cold. He had just sentenced men to die. Klaus would die. His crews would die. And they would die believing they were being saved. At 0532 hours on December 19th, 1944, the forest erupted. The first explosion was a deep, guttural roar that tore through the pre-dawn stillness, powerful enough to physically shake the ground 3 miles away. It was followed by a second, then a third, then a rapid, cascading chain of detonations. In the darkness, the northeastern horizon lit up with a sickening orange glow, the funeral pyres of German Panzers. Klaus died instantly. His command tank hit a telemine that ripped through the thin belly armor and detonated the ammunition stores in a white-hot flash. In his final moment, he never knew. He died a professional soldier, following legitimate orders from a trusted command to avoid an ambush that never existed. 23 of his crewmen died with him in the first 30 seconds. By sunrise, thanks to the American artillery that had zeroed in on the trapped and crippled column, the entire Eisenfaust-Wehr battalion had ceased to exist. 2 miles to the west, 300 American GIs were violently woken by the sound of distant thunder. They scrambled for their rifles and manned their positions, bracing for an attack that never came. Captain Morrison found Eddie in his foxhole 3 hours after dawn. He didn't bring MPs this time. He came alone, holding Eddie's confiscated notebook. He slid down into the foxhole, the silence stretching between them, thick and heavy. Finally, Morrison spoke, his voice low and devoid of emotion. Intelligence found something interesting this morning. A German Panzer column, completely annihilated, exactly where your notes predicted a major minefield was. He looked up from the notebook, his eyes locking onto Eddie's. Funny thing is, they weren't supposed to be anywhere near there. They were supposed to be rolling over our fuel depot. Eddie said nothing. The German radio we took from you. Morrison continued, his voice flat. It went missing from the CI tent sometime around 0130 hours. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you, Corporal? Eddie finally met the captain's gaze. No, sir. No, sir. Morrison studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. He didn't find it. He sighed and set the notebook down on the dirt floor between them. What you did, if you did, it was the single most reckless and insubordinate act I have ever witnessed. You impersonated the enemy. You risked exposing our positions. If you had been caught, you'd be dead, and you might have taken this whole company with you. That's not heroism, Voss. That's a firing squad offence. Eddie nodded slowly. I know, sir. Morrison stood up, brushing the dirt from his uniform. He looked exhausted. I'm writing a report. It will state that the German column was likely deceived by a new Allied psychological warfare unit operating in the sector. I'm recommending you for a Bronze Star for your exceptional intelligence gathering. He paused at the edge of the foxhole. I'm also transferring you. Effective immediately. You're going to a quiet signals depot in Luxembourg. I never want to see you within 100 miles of the front lines, or a piece of enemy equipment, ever again. Do we have an understanding? Yes, sir. The captain was about to leave, but he turned back one last time. Voss, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Those 300 men who are alive this morning, they'll never know your name. There won't be any parades. This story will never be told. Can you live with that? Eddie thought of Klaus. He thought of the smoker's rasp he would never hear again. He thought of the men who died following a voice they trusted. I can live with it, sir. Morrison gave a single, sharp nod, and then he was gone. Eddie Voss spent the rest of the war in a quiet supply depot in Luxembourg. He maintained communication equipment, trained new radio operators, and followed every order to the letter. He never again tuned into an unauthorized frequency. He never again touched a piece of enemy equipment. He did his job, kept his head down, and waited for the war to end. After VE Day, he was honorably discharged and returned to Milwaukee. He married his sweetheart, raised 3 children, and went back to work for the electric company, diagnosing problems in the city's power grid, not with scavenged headphones, but with a trained ear and a quiet intuition. He was a good father, a loving husband, and a pillar of his community. He never told a soul, not his wife, not his children, not his closest friends, about what truly happened on that frozen December night in the Ardennes. The secret of Klaus, of the minefield, of the voice from the void, was a weight he carried alone, a silent penance he paid for the rest of his life. He passed away in 1987 at the age of 64, a quiet American hero whose greatest battle was never recorded. For decades, the strange, suicidal charge of the Eisenfaust Wehr Battalion remained a curious footnote in the voluminous histories of the Battle of the Bulge. Military analysts chalked it up to the fog of war, a catastrophic intelligence failure, a commander who suffered a breakdown under pressure, or simply a tragic coincidence. The truth remained buried, not under the Belgian soil, but in the silence of a man who understood that some stories can never be told. Eddie Voss never fired a shot in combat, but he fought one of the most critical engagements of the battle, armed with nothing more than a stolen radio, 4 days of meticulous observation, and the immense courage to break every rule when it mattered most. His story is a powerful reminder that war is not just fought by generals moving pins on a map or by soldiers charging machine gun nests. It is also fought in the silent, lonely spaces in between, in the frozen foxholes, over the crackling airwaves, and in the conscience of a single man forced to make an impossible choice. His actions force us to ask a difficult question. What is true heroism? Is it following orders without question, trusting the system to do what's right? Or is it found in the willingness to defy that very system when you see it failing, to take an impossible risk, not for glory or medals, but simply because it's the right thing to do? The system was prepared to sacrifice 300 men. Eddie Voss was not. In the end, war is not always won by those who follow the rules. Sometimes, it's won by those who understand precisely when, and why, they must be broken. The story of Eddie Voss and his forbidden radio transmission will never appear in an official history book, but it deserves to be remembered. And now, we want to hear from you. Do you believe Eddie was a hero, or was Captain Morrison right, that his actions were a reckless gamble that simply happened to pay off? What would you have done in that frozen foxhole? Let us know your honest opinion in the comments below. It's a conversation worth having. And if you believe that the untold stories of World War II's invisible heroes deserve a voice, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. because history is filled with men like Eddie Voss, and this is where we honor their memory. Thank you for watching.